So, what is intimate partner violence? The CDC defines IPV as abuse or aggression that occurs in a romantic relationship. Currently, and within the context of children, there are two prevailing theories as to the causes of IPV perpetuation: social learning and cultural environment. Social learning theory is a theory of learning process which proposes that new behaviors can be acquired by observing and imitating others. Cultural environment, or male dominance theory, is a theory that male dominance may be explained by the biological differences between men and women. However, one theory which has been gathering attention lately is the theory that perpetuation of IPV also stems from inheritable traits and traumatic experiences, which may be passed down through several generations. This is what we call the trans or intergenerational transmission of domestic violence. The general idea here is that the social learning and male dominance theories alone cannot fully explain the perpetuation of IPV. There must be consideration of biological factors such as inheritable traits and trauma. A major study from 2012 examined experimental rats for the purpose of understanding how biological factors contribute to the intergenerational transmission of IPV. Here, it's important to pay attention to the outcome of the offspring's behavior, and to note that this study does not include aspects of social learning. It's also important to note that the study is focused on parent rats who experience peripubertal stress experienced around the time of puberty. The male and female rats were labeled F0 and the offspring F1. So how did this study work? The male F0 rats were taken out of their home cages and exposed to two different fear-inducing factors. One, synthetic fox feces odor, and two, elevated platforms. These stressful experiences lasted for 25 minutes each. They were then placed back in their home cages. As to the female F0 rats, they were housed in groups of 3 upon arrival. After 1 week, they were individually caged with a 3-month-old male F0 rat belonging to either a control group or a peripubertally stressed group exposed to those stressors we mentioned before for a period of 21 days. They were left to reproduce. 2 days after the female F0 rat reproduced their offspring, the mother rats were moved back into their original cages for behavioral examination that lasted 6 to 7 weeks. As to the male F1 offspring rats, they were housed with 2 others until adulthood 3 months later. They were then caged with naive female F1 rats for a similar period of 21 days to cohabitate. So, what were the results? As to the male F0 rats, the results showed that the peripubertally stressed males who cohabitated with the female rats showed more aggression than the control group and attacked the female rats whenever their home cages were changed. As to the female F0 rats, the female rats who cohabitated with the peripubertally stressed males showed defensive submissive behavior, unlike the control group, such as lying still on their backs. Moreover, they showed depression-like symptoms similar to those found in human victims of IPV. Some of these depression-like symptoms are shown by physiological, psychological, and behavioral changes. Such changes were decreased body weight, increased anxiety, increased startled responses to novel objects, increased motor reactivity, and enhanced fear responses to mild aversive stimulation. At a neurobiological level, there was an activation of serotonergic neurons in the DRN, or dorsal raphe nucleus. Serotonergic neurons in the DRN have been implicated in the pathophysiology of depression and relates to the difficulty in coping with stressful situations. These neurons are highly activated by aversive, uncontrollable events, which lead to depression-like behavior. As to the offspring, it was observed that those without postnatal contact with their violent father rats, and with the same kind of postnatal maternal care as those of female rats from control groups, reproduced the same response patterns of their peripuberally stressed fathers towards their female partners. This was aggressive behavior. Moreover, the females who cohabitated with these aggressive offspring rats displayed the same depression-like symptoms as the original female F0 group. What this study tells us is that the transmission of behavior has been proven and must be accounted for in analyzing the reasons for IPV perpetuation. Next, we will discuss how traumatic experiences may spread and be passed down to generations, similarly causing offspring of parents who have experienced trauma to reproduce behavior and characteristics similar in their parents who have PTSD. This is called epigenetic inheritance. The transmission of these phenotypes, or observable traits or behaviors, are associated with environmental exposures and include but are not limited to life experiences such as trauma or environmental enrichment. It's important to note that exposure to these experiences can be prenatal, early postnatal, or in adulthood, and that such intergenerational epigenetic inheritance can span across multiple generations as well. In terms of rodents, one study based on unpredictable maternal separation combined with unpredictable maternal stress during the early postnatal period of animal offspring led to depression-like symptoms, increased risk-taking, and antisocial behaviors in the mothers, which were transmitted through the fourth generation. Moreover, under this model of study, the exposed mice and their offspring displayed memory deterioration both in the ability to recognize objects and to store memory. Other studies demonstrated that apart from environmental stress, exposure to abusive drugs can affect intergenerational inheritance. Offspring of males addicted to cocaine display deficits in memory, while female rats exposed to alcohol for 4 weeks prior to conception reproduced exaggerated stress hormone responses within their offspring. We now turn to epigenetic inheritance in human beings. Studies focused on this topic analyzed survivors and offspring of survivors of historic tragedies. To preface the studies, in the 1990s, research addressing biological explanations of intergenerational effect of trauma began. But before then, discussions about epigenetic transmission based on trauma could not be fully explained by science. As the work developed, greater understanding of the molecular biology provided the tools to examine the phenomenon. One particular study of Holocaust survivors and their offspring demonstrated that the offspring were at a greater risk of development of PTSD, depression, and anxiety disorder. Further research showed that trauma in the survivors altered the way their offspring react to stress through neurobiological changes in the regulation of stress-related pathways, lowered cortisol levels, and increased GR sensitivity. This study showed that for the next decade, the survivors' offspring who had no exposure to traumatic experiences were more likely to exhibit similar depression-like symptoms that their parents had experienced due to PTSD. Moreover, these changes in their ability to regulate stress impacted the way they handled their own trauma. Similarly, an observation of survivors of 9/11 demonstrated that their offspring had lower cortisol level in association with maternal PTSD, which was more acute for mothers who were exposed to the trauma in their third trimester. Another study in a Dutch hunger cohort exposed to famine prenatally during 1944 to 1945 demonstrated that the survivors' grandchildren developed adiposity as a result, the condition of having too much fatty tissue in their body. Finally, a recent study of sperm in men with adverse childhood experiences demonstrated an alteration in their microRNA similar to that observed in mice exposed to conditioned stressors. MicroRNAs are a class of non-coding RNAs which play important roles in regulating stress. So, why is all of this information important? It is because now that we have confirmed that epigenetic and biological phenotypes have been transmitted across multiple generations in animals and human beings, it gives us a fuller understanding of the causes of IPV perpetuation. As the evidence suggests, it is possible to curtail and reverse the effects of these traits starting even prenatally. The studies suggest that to do this, either the mother or the offspring should be subjected to environmental enrichment. Postnatal environmental enrichment takes the form of exposure to appropriate parenting from weaning until adulthood, and has been shown to develop a resistance to depression and depression-like behavior in the offspring of mice. Mothers' exposure to prenatal environmental enrichment have demonstrated enhanced maternal care and/or reduced anxiety and improved cognitive performance in their offspring. Furthermore, exposure has been shown to reverse the negative effects of inherited trauma after transmission to the offspring. So, how does this relate to the law? Specifically in New York, Section 240 of the Domestic Relations Law requires that in a custody case where a party alleges that the other party has committed an act of IPV against the alleging party or any family member, and such allegation is proven by a preponderance of evidence, the court must consider the effects of IPV upon the best interest of the child. Altogether, this forms the court's presumption against awarding child custody to the batterer. Although the court is required to state on record how they factored IPV into its decision regarding custody, as of now, they only look at the facts and circumstances regarding the IPV. Based on what we've learned thus far, it is crucial that the offspring of parents who were exposed to IPV are nurtured within an optimal enriching environment to reverse or diminish the offspring's inherited biological and epigenetic traits. This requires adequate nurturing and participation by both parents. The law, as it currently stands, is too capable of quickly separating families due to the existence of IPV in one parent, and ignores the significance of both parents' contribution to the child's development. Therefore, the proposal here for the amendment of Section 240 seeks to include additional factors that courts should be required to consider beyond the mere existence of IPV when deciding child custody. Such additional factors should be 1. The severity of the IPV itself which the child witnesses, 2. The perspective of the child, and 3. The effects of stress which separation has on mothers who must raise children on their own. A critical but difficult question of whether children should have contact with their violent fathers is never easily answered, because fathers' violence have different effects on the victim and the offspring, and the explanations for violence must account for numerous factors, such as drug and alcohol use, inherent psychological, physiological, and behavioral predispositions, and stress and trauma. One study suggests that children who had contact with their fathers who committed IPV do not differ in psychological well-being from those who do not have post-separation contact with their fathers. However, other studies suggest differently, with results which demonstrate that post-separation contact with fathers actually increases child well-being. A crucial possible explanation for this is that the quality of post-separation contact that fathers have with their children is extremely low. Fathers are not expressing the engaged and active fathering that may be necessary to generate positive effects on children's development. Another possible explanation is that fathers who use violence may not possess the capacity to care for their children and need education to provide appropriate care. But as of now, what we do know is that children do benefit from contact with their fathers post-separation and within the context of IPV. As to the first consideration, this is necessary because it would be unconscionable to use only the existence of IPV as a reason to decide against custody when the instance of IPV may in fact be remote in time or minuscule in its degree. Factors to consider in assessing the severity of IPV should include, but not be limited to, frequency, choice of tactics, use of lethal weapons, and child abuse. Also, assessment of severity should also include an examination of the stress which every member of the family exposed to IPV within their household experiences. As to the second consideration, in the 1990s, the introduction of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child and the associated child movement saw a significant shift in the way children witnesses of IPV were perceived. This was called the new sociology of childhood. Through this lens, children were considered the experts in their own lives, and their perspectives were increasingly sought in research associated with IPV. Studies showed that most children are aware of IPV's occurrence within their home, even when parents believe it was hidden from them. Unfortunately, evidence suggests that children witness perspective of IPV are not considered within fatherhood programs for fathers who use violence. This consideration is incredibly important because in thinking about the best interests of the child, it would be common sense to integrate the child's perspective in deciding on child custody. A study of child witness perspectives showed that when asked about their key messages for their fathers who used violence, the children described wanting their fathers to understand the significant impact of their violence on their lives. They expressed wanting their fathers to make amends, and strikingly, a majority wanted to stay in contact with their fathers. This study was focused on the reparations which these children sought, and a central tenet of the reparation described was the need for children and young people themselves to control the process of father-child contact, and to determine the degree of involvement that fathers should have in their lives after domestic violence. The third consideration is the effect that stress from separation has on mothers who must raise children on their own. This consideration is important because through it, the courts must look at how suitable mothers would be to provide adequate care to their children after separation within the IPV context. Studies have shown that mothers who experience high levels of parental stress report greater psychological distress and general life dissatisfaction than those with low levels of stress. Consequently, this affects their parenting abilities and is associated with low levels of child development. Taking a look at family unions, mother and fathers in cohabitating or marital relationships, we can see numerous factors that likely decrease parental stress. One of them is an increase in economic resources of the mother and her children. Couples typically pull together their resources and share in expenses, leaving the mother better equipped to provide for her children. Another factor is an increase in social resources. Couples who cohabitate or are married are better able to provide emotional support for one another and the children, and are likely to split the child caretaking responsibilities and delegate to one another the appropriate roles. What has been found not to decrease parental stress is a study of non-biological social fathers, who demonstrate that social fathers typically exhibit less commitment to their non-biological child's well-being. Moreover, adding new family members into the family has been shown to cause intra-family conflict and may result in increased levels of stress. Now, we look at the numerous factors which increase parental stress after divorce and/or separation. Typically, separation is associated with changes in employment. Studies suggest that mothers find it necessary to work longer hours or to enter the workforce. Dissolution of marriage is also associated with loss of social resources. Single parenthood makes it difficult for mothers to supervise or discipline their children, and reduced connections to family, friends, and the support of the community equals a loss of physical and emotional support. Overall, increased parental socioeconomic resources are the driving force behind protecting families undergoing structural transitions against its negative effects. On another note, evidence suggests that maternal parental stress leads to greater risk of child maltreatment, and when compounded with IPV, the risk becomes more acute. The study suggests that increased child maltreatment risk among mothers who are IPV victims may be explained by increased stress, depression, or unintended pregnancy resulting from IPV. A study of mothers who practice corporal punishment found that punishment is associated with decreased moral internalization and mental health within the child, decreased quality of parent-child relationships, and increased childhood and adulthood aggressive, delinquent, criminal, and antisocial behavior. Studies suggest that an enriching environment, which includes maternal warmth, mothers' use of emotion coaching, and effective parenting strategies have been linked to positive child adjustment following IPV. When looking at father involvement, studies have shown that a biological father's exit from the child's residence is associated with decreases in co-parenting and increases in maternal parental stress. And more maternal stress leads to the child's greater issues with externalizing and internalizing IPV. In terms of child well-being, numerous studies indicate that positive father involvement is incontrovertibly important in promoting their well-being and development. Starting at young ages, children have demonstrated improved language development and social competence simply because of father's involvement in reading activity. These studies have also suggested that the key aspect of father's involvement with his children is accessibility to the child, often conceptualized in terms of the father's residential status. Essentially, the less accessibility a father has to the child, the less beneficial the father can be for their child's development. So now we know there's an additional explanation for the perpetuation of IPV, the transgenerational transmission of domestic violence. But what do we do with this information? The proposal to amend Section 240 is just one step, and it's a suggestion for what the courts should consider in the process of deciding on child custody. The best interest of the child is the main priority, and the courts should seek to review every case in its totality to achieve that goal. This is not to say that all fathers deserve to stay in contact with their children, but there are definitely those who have worked hard and will work hard in mending their broken relationships with their children and their spouses. This kind of change won't magically happen overnight, but like all things, it will take time.